night of 21st November 1939, and the Thames estuary is dying. Ships are not going down to enemy torpedoes. They are not being stalked by U-boats they can see. They are exploding without warning, keels broken as if by the fist of some invisible giant rising from the seabed. The destroyer HMS Gypsy is gone. The brand new cruiser HMS Belfast, barely a year old, pride of the Royal Navy, limps into port with her keel shattered, her back broken by a force no one can explain. Since the first week of the war, 29 merchant vessels have simply ceased to exist in British coastal waters. Survivors speak of detonations from below. No wakes, no periscopes, no floating mines, nothing. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty, is not a man given to panic. But in the autumn of 1939, he writes a single, devastating sentence in his private notes. He fears this new menace might, in his own words, compass Britain's ruin. The weapon doing all this damage weighs roughly as much as a family motor car. It makes no sound. It leaves no trace. It sits silently on the seabed, in the mud and silt of Britain's own harbours, and waits. It does not care about the season or the weather or the darkness. It does not tire. It simply waits for the magnetic heartbeat of a steel ship passing overhead, and then it ends that ship, and everyone in it. The German magnetic mine. It is the most dangerous naval weapon deployed in the opening months of the Second World War, and understanding it, tearing apart its secrets on the mudflats of Essex in the small hours of a November morning, will give the British something far more powerful in return. This is the story of how Britain turned an enemy's invisible weapon into its own, and in doing so brought the war to the very doorstep of the German Kriegsmarine. To understand why the magnetic mine caused such terror, you have to understand the world it was born into. For a century and more, the naval mine had been essentially unchanged in principle, a buoyant sphere bristling with contact horns, tethered to the seabed by a cable, floating just beneath the surface. Hit one, and it explodes. Simple, brutal, and, crucially, relatively simple to deal with. Conventional minesweepers could tow cutting gear that severed mooring cables, sending the mines bobbing to the surface, where they could be destroyed by rifle fire. Britain entered the war with thousands of trained minesweeping vessels built precisely for this task. The Admiralty knew the game. It had played it before in the last Great War. So when the losses began in the first weeks of September 1939, 4 ships totalling some 14,575 gross registered tons sunk within days of the war's outbreak. The minesweepers were dispatched. They found nothing, swept the areas repeatedly, nothing. The officers concluded it must be torpedo attacks, even though no survivors reported seeing torpedo wakes. The mystery compounded with each passing week. What the Germans had done was to remove the mine from its traditional environment entirely. The new weapon lay flat on the seabed, in the shallows of harbours and estuaries and coastal shipping lanes, all those places that ships absolutely must pass through. It could not be seen. It could not be swept by conventional gear, and it could not be detected at all, because it was simply part of the seafloor. The physics exploited by this weapon are elegant and merciless. Every steel ship that sails through the Earth's magnetic field becomes, in effect, a moving magnet. The hull aligns with the planet's magnetic lines of force, acquiring a vertical and horizontal magnetic signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. The German mine contained a finely calibrated needle mechanism, a dip needle, sensitive enough to detect the horizontal component of that magnetic disturbance as a ship passed overhead. The needle moved, a contact closed, a circuit completed, and 600 pounds of high explosive converted a ship into fragments. By the end of 1939, Germany had deployed some 470 magnetic mines in British waters. They had already sunk or damaged dozens of vessels. The port of the Thames, the very artery of British commerce, was being strangled. Naval intelligence estimated that if the problem could not be solved within months, Britain's coastal trade would effectively cease. The island nation that had survived every siege in its history was facing blockade from within its own harbours. The breakthrough came on the mudflats of Shoeburyness, on the Essex coast, in the early hours of 23rd November 1939. 2 nights earlier, a soldier on sentry duty at the Royal Artillery Range had watched a Luftwaffe Heinkel He-111 release a parachute-borne object into the shallows of the Thames estuary. The object had sunk below the surface, but the tide was on the ebb, and by the following evening it was possible to see the glistening outline of something lying in the mud. The Admiralty was notified immediately, and from April 1940, Bomber Command began what would become one of the most sustained and strategically significant campaigns of the entire war. The operation was given the codename Gardening. The mines were sown in coded areas, designated by the names of vegetables, trees and plants. Kiel Bay became lettuce. The approaches to the Elbe became artichokes. The Gironde estuary in occupied France became forget-me-nots. The Kattegat, through which all German Baltic traffic was funneled, was worked constantly throughout the war. Aircrew flew at below 1,500 feet, dangerously low, vulnerable to flak, dropping mines one after another in precise patterns across shipping lanes they had memorized from charts. The mines forced the Germans to keep enormous resources committed to mine clearance. By some estimates, upwards of 20,000 German military personnel were engaged at any given time in mine-sweeping duties, mine disposal, and the operation of the Speerbrecher, a fleet of converted merchant ships fitted with powerful magnetic field generators to detonate mines ahead of convoys. Over 50 of these vessels were sunk during the war, destroyed by the mines they were built to counter. It is worth examining honestly where the Germans and British stood in terms of this technology, because the popular narrative of British genius defeating German deviousness somewhat obscures the fuller picture. Germany entered the war with a functioning magnetic mine, and critically had prioritised its delivery by aircraft, which gave it immediate strategic range. The Luftwaffe's Heinkel, He-111s and He-115 seaplanes were laying mines in British waters. From November 1939, reaching harbours that no surface vessel or submarine could access. Germany also led in tactical innovation with mine fusing. They were the first to deploy acoustic mines, pressure mines, and combination fuses that used multiple triggers simultaneously, making sweeping vastly more complex. Their ship counter mechanism, which allowed a mine to count a preset number of ship passages before triggering, was a particular refinement that caused the British sustained difficulty. Where Britain held a clear technical advantage was in the fundamental detection mechanism. The German dip needle system, based on detecting the vertical component of the magnetic field, was more susceptible to the Earth's own magnetic variation and less consistent at different latitudes. The British CR rod design, detecting the rate of change in the horizontal field component, was both more reliable and more difficult to defeat by simple degaussing. German attempts to produce coiled rod mines in quantity were hampered by severe shortages of the copper and nickel required, precisely the materials that a naval blockade tends to restrict. Estimates suggest Germany had only around 1,500 magnetic mines available in the spring of 1940, far short of the 50,000 originally envisaged by the Kriegsmarine's planning staff. The Americans observed both programs throughout the war. When the US entered the conflict and began its own aerial mining campaign, most devastatingly against Japan in 1945, it drew heavily on British experience and British mine designs. American B-29 superfortresses carried British pattern mines into the approaches of every major Japanese port in the closing year of the war, closing Hiroshima and Kobe for days at a time, cutting Japanese freight traffic by 90%. The mine warfare doctrine Arthur Harris had built at Bomber Command, seeding the sea lanes of occupied Europe, had crossed an ocean and found new application. The true scale of what gardening achieved is still, in some quarters, underappreciated. By the war's end, RAF Bomber Command had dropped 47,307 mines in enemy waters, 80% of all Allied offensive mining in the European theatre. British mines, worldwide, are reckoned to have sunk 1,047 enemy vessels and damaged a further 541. In the European theatre alone, the RAF's mining campaign sank 545 merchant ships and 217 warships. Crucially, those figures were achieved at a fraction of the cost of conventional bombing. In the 20 months following the start of the gardening campaign, mines sank or damaged 164 Axis ships at a cost of 94 aircraft. Direct aerial attacks on the same shipping had sunk or damaged 105 ships, at a cost of 373 aircraft. The strategic effect went beyond the numbers. The Kiel Canal, the vital waterway linking Germany's Baltic and North Sea coasts, through which U-boats transited to their operational areas, was repeatedly mined and repeatedly forced to suspend traffic. German admirals could not move major surface units without elaborate mine-sweeping operations that consumed time, resources, and fuel. The Bismarck's famous sortie in May 1941 had to be carefully routed through swept channels, maintained at enormous cost. The psychological effect on the German naval command was profound. Every passage through home waters required a reckoning with the possibility of what lay invisibly on the seafloor. The original German mine that started all of this, the Type GA recovered from the Shoebryness mudflats by Ouvry and Baldwin in the November darkness of 1939, still exists. It can be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London, inert and unremarkable in its cylindrical grey casing, stripped of its detonators, stripped of its charge. King George VI came to HMS Vernon in December 1939 to present Ouvry with the Distinguished Service Order, the first Royal Naval decoration of the Second World War, with the disarmed mine displayed nearby. It was fitting. The weapon that had threatened to close Britain's ports became, within weeks, the key that unlocked everything. Return to that November night, the mudflats at Shoebryness, the darkness, the slither of 500 yards through cold, slimy Essex mud. Two men with tools made of brass, approaching a weapon whose exact specifications no Allied engineer had ever seen. The ticking of a clockwork mechanism that could at any moment have ended both of them and left the mystery unsolved. They did not know in that moment what the mine would give them. They knew only that it had to be understood, that the alternative, leaving the enemy in sole possession of an invisible weapon that was strangling the arteries of an island nation, was unacceptable. And so Ouvry crouched in the mud, and Baldwin held the light, and the tools turned, and the detonators came free, and the clock stopped ticking. Within months, the British had built their own version, refined in crucial respects, and handed it to Bomber Command. Arthur Harris, the same officer who had first proposed airdropped magnetic mines back in 1936, and who commanded the first such sortie in April 1940, would eventually command 47,307 mine-laying sorties from Bomber Command alone. Each of those sorties carried an invisible weapon to the waters of the enemy. Each mine sat on the seafloor in the darkness, in the mud of German harbours and Norwegian fjords and French river mouths, and waited, patiently, for the magnetic signature of a steel ship to pass overhead. The Germans had designed a weapon to strangle Britain. They dropped one by accident on an artillery range in Essex. 4 nights later, 2 officers from HMS Vernon walked out across the mud and brought it home. And in doing so, they ensured that it would be the Kriegsmarine's turn to fear the invisible thing lying in the darkness at the bottom of the sea. 762 Axis ships. That is the official tally for the RAF gardening campaign alone. Ships that never reached port, cargoes that never arrived, U-boats that never sailed, the Kiel Canal that fell silent again and again, while sweepers worked against a tide of British mines that never stopped coming. Britain had begun the war with ships exploding in its own harbours, baffled by a weapon it could not see or understand. It ended the war having mastered that weapon so completely and deployed it so relentlessly that Germany's own admirals wrote bitter reports to Hitler about the impossibility of moving through their own waters. The invisible weapon had changed hands, and it never changed back.